Somebody get Emily a lawn chair before she tries to do anything useful and hurts herself again. That was my cousin Derek, standing at the head of his brand new redwood patio table, tongs in one hand, craft beer in the other, surrounded by 40 of our closest relatives on the 4th of July. He said it loud enough for every single one of them to hear. Loud enough for the neighbors on both sides of his fence. Loud enough that his 8-year-old daughter looked up from her sparkler and stared at me with that particular expression children get when they know something cruel just happened, but can't quite name it. He wasn't yelling. That's the thing about Derek. He never yells. He says the worst things in this easygoing, buddy-buddy tone, like he's doing you a favor by pointing out what everyone else is already thinking. And the worst part, the part that made my face burn while I stood there holding a bowl of potato salad I'd driven an hour and 40 minutes to bring, was that half the family laughed. Not all of them. Not my Aunt Colleen, who closed her eyes like she'd just gotten a migraine. Not my little brother Jason, who was already halfway out of his chair before I caught his eye and shook my head. But enough of them. Enough cousins, enough aunts, enough of Derek's friends who didn't know me from anyone, chuckling along because the host was chuckling, and that's how it works at a barbecue. You laugh with the guy holding the tongs. What Derek didn't know, what nobody at that table knew except me and a man named Colonel Raymond Bassett, who was at that moment roughly 2,000 miles away at Fort Liberty, was that 6 days earlier I had been formally recommended for the Silver Star. What Derek didn't know was that the woman he'd just told to sit down before she hurt herself had, 14 months prior, coordinated a medevac extraction under fire in a place I still can't name publicly, pulled a 19-year-old private out of a drainage canal with both hands while mortar rounds dropped close enough to feel the heat on my neck, and done it all while transmitting on a frequency that 3 separate units were depending on to stay alive. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Emily Rourke. I'm 31 years old. I'm a Sergeant First Class in the United States Army, currently assigned to 3rd Special Forces Group out of Fort Liberty, North Carolina, though my role is support rather than the kind that gets movies made about it. I'm a communications specialist. I coordinate frequencies, manage tactical networks, and when things go sideways in the field, I'm the voice that keeps people connected to the people who can save them. My call sign is Compass, not because I chose it, because during my second deployment, a team leader named Warrant Officer Alexei Petrov told me I was the only person on the net who always knew which direction everyone else needed to go. He started calling me Compass on comms, and it stuck. It stuck so hard it followed me to my next unit and the one after that. I'm 5'4". I weigh 132 pounds. I have brown hair that I keep in a regulation bun so tight it gives me headaches by 1400 hours. And I have a scar on my left forearm from a piece of shrapnel that I didn't even notice until someone pointed out I was bleeding. I look, according to my mother, like a kindergarten teacher. According to my grandmother, God rest her, I look like the kind of girl who should be arranging flowers at church. According to Derek, I look like someone who needs a lawn chair. My grandmother is the reason I need to tell this story properly. Her name was Maureen Callahan Rourke, and she raised me from age 9 after my parents' divorce turned into something neither of them could navigate with children in the car. Grandma Maureen was a seamstress in Brockton, Massachusetts, 5'0", hands like leather from decades of industrial sewing machines, and she had this way of saying things once that made them stay in your head for the rest of your life. The morning I left for basic training, she stood on her front porch in her housecoat, coffee in one hand, rosary in the other, and she said to me, "Emily, the world is full of loud people who are wrong. Don't become one of them. Be the quiet person who is right, and wait. The waiting is the hard part, but the waiting is where the power is." I thought about that sentence every single day of basic. I thought about it during my first deployment to Afghanistan. I thought about it the night I sat in a communications tent in an undisclosed location, and listened to a young soldier scream for help over a radio, while I, calmly, methodically, precisely, guided a helicopter to his coordinates, while rounds cracked in the background. I thought about it the day Grandma Maureen died, which was 11 months before that barbecue, and I was not there because I was overseas and could not get back in time. I thought about it while I stood in Derek's backyard, holding my potato salad, listening to the laughter fade into the sound of ice clinking and someone changing the Bluetooth speaker to a Jimmy Buffett playlist. And I thought about it 6 days later, when a man I had never met walked through Derek's gate at the family's follow-up cookout, saw the unit patch on the old jacket I draped over my chair, and said 2 words that changed everything. But I need to go back further. I need you to understand what Derek was to this family, what I was to this family, and why 40 people laughing at a lawn chair comment was not a surprise, but a pattern so old it had grooves worn into it like the stairs in my grandmother's house. This is the story of how I stood still while my cousin tried to make me small, and how the thing that saved me wasn't anger, wasn't revenge, wasn't even the silver star. It was the fact that I had spent my entire adult life becoming someone real, while Derek had spent his becoming someone loud. And eventually, in front of everyone who mattered, the difference between those 2 things became impossible to ignore. My name is Megan Ashcroft, and I grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is the kind of town where the military is not something you talk about at dinner parties. It is dinner. It is the air. Fort Bragg sat on the edge of everything, and the sound of artillery practice rolled through the pines on Tuesday mornings like distant thunder you stopped noticing by the time you were 6. My father was a communications sergeant with 3rd Special Forces Group. He did 3 rotations in Afghanistan before I was 12 and 1 more after. My mother was a dental hygienist at the VA clinic on Rayford Road, and she held our family together with patience and meal prep Sundays and a silence about hard things that I inherited completely. I was small. I have always been small. 5'3", 118 pounds soaking wet. Narrow shoulders. A face people called sweet. I had brown hair I kept short because it was easier under a helmet, and I had my mother's habit of looking at the ground when someone raised their voice. If you saw me at a grocery store, you would think school teacher, maybe librarian. You would not think the thing I actually was, which is the part that matters. I enlisted at 17 with my father's signature on the consent form. I went to basic at Fort Jackson, then AIT at Fort Huachuca for military intelligence. I was good at languages. Pashto first, then Dari, then enough Arabic to get by. By 23, I was attached to a Special Operations Task Force running source operations in Nangarhar Province, which is a sentence I still cannot say at Thanksgiving without someone changing the subject. I was not a trigger puller in the traditional sense. I was the person who sat in rooms with local nationals and convinced them to share information that kept the trigger pullers alive. My call sign was Finch. Not because I chose it, because my team chief, a massive guy named Sergeant First Class Harlan Dwyer, said I reminded him of a finch. Small, quiet, and you only notice it's there because it won't stop coming back. Harlan was the closest thing I had to a mentor after my father became someone I loved but could not reach. Dad came home from his 4th deployment different. Not broken, not angry, just somewhere else, even when he was sitting right next to you. He would look at me, and I could see the effort it took him to be present, and I never blamed him. But I also stopped going to him with things that mattered because I could feel the weight it added. Harlan filled that space without either of us naming it. He was 51, from outside Roanoke, Virginia, and he had a way of teaching you something without ever making you feel taught. His phrase, the one he said to me the night before the operation that earned me the Silver Star, was simple. He said, "Finch, loud is just scared turned inside out. Remember that when it counts." I remembered. in the specific way you remember something your body learns, not your mind. Now, Derek. Derek Ashcroft was my father's brother's only son, which made him my first cousin, which made him unavoidable. He was 3 years older, 6 inches taller, and had the kind of confidence that comes from never once being tested by anything harder than a community college biology final. He played JV football at 71st High School, rode the bench, and talked about it for 15 years like he had carried the team to state. After graduation, he sold cars at a Dodge dealership on Skibo Road, then insurance, then something with supplements that might have been an MLM, and by the time of the barbecue, he was calling himself an entrepreneur, which in practice meant he had a podcast with 11 listeners and a leased Tahoe. None of that would have mattered. People find their paths. I have no contempt for someone figuring things out. What I had contempt for, what I had swallowed for years until the taste of it was permanent, was the way Derek treated me specifically. Because Derek had decided early, maybe when we were kids, maybe when I came home from my first deployment too thin and too quiet, that I was the family member it was safe to be cruel to. And the family had agreed by never once asking him to stop. It started small. It always does. At my welcome home gathering in 2014, Derek told a table of aunts and uncles that I probably just answered phones over there. I was 22. I had been back from Nangarhar for 9 days. I still had dust in the seams of my duffel bag and a recommendation for a bronze star sitting in an admin queue. And I said nothing, because my mother's hand found my knee under the table and squeezed, and the squeeze meant, please, not here, not today. At my grandmother's 80th birthday in 2016, Derek announced during his toast that he was the only Ashcroft man tough enough to have gone military, but smart enough not to. He looked right at me when he said, man. Everyone laughed. My grandmother, Nana Ruth, did not laugh. She looked at me across the table with those sharp little eyes, and later in the kitchen, drying a casserole dish while I washed it, she said something I carry with me still. She said, baby girl, some people build houses. Some people just walk through them making noise. You keep building. Nana Ruth died the following March. Pneumonia. Fast and mean. I was at Camp Humphreys in South Korea when I got the Red Cross message, and I made it home 14 hours too late. And Derek gave the eulogy, and he did not mention me once. I stood in the back row at that funeral, in a dress uniform I had pressed on the ironing board of a Comfort Inn outside Fort Campbell, because my flight had been rerouted twice and I landed in Nashville at 4 in the morning and drove straight through. My shoes were regulation. My medals were pinned correctly. My posture was the posture of someone who had learned a long time ago that if you stand straight enough, people might not notice you are shaking. Derek stood at the pulpit in a navy suit that was too tight across the shoulders and talked about Nana Ruth's lemon pound cake and her love of Wheel of Fortune and the way she used to call him her little rooster because he was always the first one up in the morning. He talked for 11 minutes. I counted. He mentioned Uncle Vince, Aunt Darlene, his sister Heather, his mother Pauline, his own 2 sons by name and age. He mentioned the mailman. He did not mention me. Not once. Not even as a cousin. Not even as someone who existed. And when he stepped down from the pulpit and walked past my row on the way back to his seat, he looked at me and he winked. Like it was a game. Like I was supposed to understand that being erased was just what happened to people like me. That was the second thing. The third was Thanksgiving 2019. I was back stateside by then, assigned to the 528th Sustainment Brigade out of Fort Bragg, which they have since renamed Fort Liberty, though the red clay and the pine trees do not care what you call it. I had just come back from a deployment rotation in Jordan, and I was tired in the way you get tired when your body is home, but your nervous system is still listening for something. Uncle Vince hosted at his place outside Fayetteville. Big brick house, riding mower in the garage, a deck he had built himself and talked about constantly. Derek was there with his wife Amy and their boys, and Heather was there, and my mother came down from Roanoke even though she and Uncle Vince had not spoken properly since the argument about my grandfather's truck. Dinner went fine. Turkey was dry the way turkey always is. The boys played in the yard. I helped Aunt Darlene in the kitchen because I always helped in the kitchen. And then after dinner, when the men were on the deck with beers and the women were inside cleaning, which is its own kind of parable if you think about it, Derek started talking about the military. He did this sometimes, usually after his third Budweiser, holding court about things he had never done. He had opinions about Afghanistan. He had opinions about the withdrawal timeline. He had opinions about what real soldiers looked like versus, as he put it, the ones they let in now to fill quotas. He did not say my name. He did not have to. His friend Travis, who was sitting in a camp chair with a paper plate on his knee, looked uncomfortable and changed the subject to college football, but Derek circled back. He always circled back. I was bringing out a tray of pecan pie slices when I heard him say it. He said, "I just think logistics people love to call themselves veterans like they were actually in the fight. Driving trucks and counting boxes is not combat." My buddy Kyle was a real operator, 75th Ranger Regiment, and he says the support people ride on the real warriors' coattails, and it cheapens the whole thing. I set the tray down on the deck railing. My hands were steady because I had trained them to be steady. I had convoyed through Anbar Province in 2008 when 2 vehicles in our column were hit by IEDs on the same stretch of road within 40 minutes of each other. I had pulled a specialist named Darren Kowalski out of a burning LMTV with one hand while holding pressure on my own left side with the other because a piece of shrapnel the size of a car key had gone through my flak jacket where the plate did not cover. I had a scar under my ribs that itched in cold weather. I had a bronze star with a V device in a box in my closet that I never showed anyone because showing people things was not something I did. Derek did not know any of this. Derek had never asked. In 15 years of family gatherings and holidays and funerals, and the one phone call he made when my mother was sick, which lasted 4 minutes, he had never once asked me what I did, where I went, what it was like, whether I was okay. He did not know because he did not care. And he did not care because in the architecture of his mind, I was not a person whose experiences could possibly matter more than his opinions about them. I stood there with pecan pie on a tray, and I looked at Uncle Vince to see if he would say something. He did not. He looked at his beer. I looked at my mother through the kitchen window. She was drying a plate, and she had not heard, and I was glad she had not heard, because she would have made a scene. And then Derek would have played victim, and the whole night would have collapsed into exactly the kind of chaos he thrived in. So I said nothing. I set down the tray. I went back inside. I washed the rest of the dishes, and I dried them, and I put them away in cabinets I had to ask Aunt Darlene to identify because I did not know her kitchen the way I knew a motor pool or a supply chain, or the inside of an armored vehicle at 3 a.m. in a country most of my family could not find on a map. That night, I sat in my rental car in Uncle Vince's driveway for 20 minutes before I turned the key. The engine was off, and the windows were down, and the North Carolina night was doing that thing it does in late November, where it smells like wood smoke and cold dirt and something ending. I put my hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and I pressed my forehead against them, and I breathed. I did not cry. I had cried once, in a portable latrine in Balad in 2009, after we lost Kowalski to an infection 3 weeks after I pulled him out. I had decided then that crying was something I would do alone and in private, and only for people who deserved my tears. And Derek Ashcroft did not deserve my tears. What he deserved was to keep talking. Because people who talk long enough eventually say the thing that undoes them. And I had learned patience from the United States Army, from Nana Ruth, and from the particular endurance that comes with being underestimated so consistently that people forget you are in the room. I drove back to the Comfort Inn. I called my mother and told her I loved her. I went to bed, and I waited. Not for revenge. I was not waiting for revenge. I was waiting for the moment when the truth would simply become unavoidable. The way sunrise is unavoidable. The way gravity is unavoidable. The way the weight of everything you have pretended not to see eventually presses down on you until something cracks. That moment was coming. I did not know exactly when. But I had learned, in convoy after convoy through hostile territory, that patience is not passivity. Patience is knowing the road. And I knew this road. The moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 weeks after the barbecue. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It came in the form of a phone call from Nana Ruth's attorney, a man named Gerald Hadwick, whose office sat above a hardware store on Commerce Street in Clarksville, and who had been handling legal affairs for our family since before I was born. He said my name. He said he was sorry to trouble me. He said Nana Ruth had asked him to call me specifically, and that there was a matter regarding updates to her estate plan that required my attention. He said it gently, the way people speak when they know the words carry weight they cannot fully measure. I was standing in the parking lot of the physical therapy clinic in Fayetteville, where I had my Tuesday appointments for the knee. The October air was sharp. Leaves blew across the asphalt in dry, scraping sounds. I held the phone against my ear and listened, and I felt something shift. Not anger, not satisfaction, just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a map you have been studying for months suddenly matches the terrain in front of you, and you realize you have been reading it correctly all along. Gerald told me that Nana Ruth had been reviewing her arrangements, that she had made certain decisions she wanted me to understand before anyone else in the family learned about them, that she had specifically requested I come to his office alone, without telling Denise or Uncle Vernon or anyone, because she wanted me to hear it from her perspective first. He said she had recorded a message, an actual recording, her voice on a small digital recorder, because her hands shook too badly now to write a long letter, and she wanted the words to be exact. I drove to Clarksville the following Saturday. I sat in Gerald's office, with its water-stained ceiling tiles and its filing cabinets that looked older than I was. He handed me a pair of earbuds and pressed play on the recorder, and I heard Nana Ruth's voice, thin and steady, the way creek water is thin and steady when it runs over limestone. She said my name. She said, "Baby girl, I need you to hear me now." She said she had watched the family for 79 years. She said she had watched who showed up and who performed showing up. She said she knew about the barbecue. She said Miss Catherine from church had been there and had told her everything. Every word Denise said, every toast Vernon gave, every moment I sat quiet in that plastic chair while people laughed about things they did not understand. She said she had cried that night. Not for me. She said she cried because she recognized the pattern. She said Vernon's father, her own son, had done the same thing to his first wife. Took credit, smiled big, let someone else carry the actual weight while he stood in the light and waved. Then her voice got quieter, and she said the part that changed everything. She said she had already transferred the deed of the farmhouse. Not in her will, not after death. Right now, while she was alive and sharp enough to make it stick. The farmhouse on Old Russellville Road, with its 11 acres and the tobacco barn and the pond where I used to catch bluegill with a cane pole. She said it was mine. She said she had also set aside a trust, not enormous, but solid, enough to cover taxes on the property for 15 years, and enough to give me a foundation if I ever needed one. She said the rest of the estate would be divided according to her original plan. Fair shares for everyone, but the farmhouse was separate. The farmhouse was mine because I had earned it. Not with money, with presence. With showing up at dark 30 to fix a porch railing. With 10 years of checks that never bounced and never came with a speech attached. With sitting in a plastic chair at a barbecue and not saying a single cruel word, even when cruelty was the only thing being served to me. The recording lasted 11 minutes. At the end, she said one more thing. She said, "Michaela, your grandfather used to tell me that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least to say. You remember that. You have never been the loudest person in any room, and that is exactly why I trust you with the thing I love most in this world." I sat in Gerald's chair for a long time after the recording ended. The earbuds were still in. There was no sound. Just my own breathing and the faint hum of the hardware store's ventilation system below, and the distant clang of someone testing a length of pipe against a concrete floor. I did not cry. I wanted to. But I had spent so many years holding steady under fire, real fire and the other kind, that my body simply would not release it. Instead, I felt a warmth in my chest that spread outward, the way a coal spreads heat when you blow on it gently. Not a blaze, just a glow. Just enough to remind me that something in me was still burning and had never gone out. Gerald asked if I had any questions. I asked him one. I asked if the transfer was legally complete, fully executed, beyond challenge. He looked at me over his glasses and said yes. He said Nana Ruth had insisted on that. He said she had told him, and here he smiled slightly, she had told him to make it tighter than a drum because she knew exactly what Vernon was going to say when he found out. I thanked him. I shook his hand. I walked down the stairs past the hardware store where a man was buying wood screws and a woman was arguing about the price of caulk, and I stepped into the October sunlight and stood on the sidewalk on Commerce Street, and I breathed. I did not call anyone. I did not post anything. I did not drive to Vernon's house or to Denise's apartment. I got in my truck and I drove out to Old Russellville Road and I parked in the gravel drive and I sat looking at the farmhouse with its white paint peeling at the eaves and its porch swing that needed a new chain and its garden where Nana Ruth used to grow tomatoes so heavy the stakes bent under them. I looked at it and I understood that this was not a reward. It was a recognition. It was someone finally saying out loud what had been true all along, that I was here, that I had always been here, that being here, quietly, consistently, without applause, was the thing that mattered most. I sat in that truck for 40 minutes before I moved. The engine was off and the windows were down, and I could hear the creek that runs behind the property. The one where Nana Ruth used to send me to cool watermelons in the summer because she said creek water made them sweeter than any refrigerator could. I listened to it, and I thought about what I needed to do, and in what order, and I thought about it the way I used to think about mission logistics, priorities, sequencing, contingencies. What happens if they find out too early? What happens if someone challenges the will? What happens if Vernon does what Vernon always does and decides that volume and repetition are the same thing as being right? I called Darla Simmons the next morning. She had been Nana Ruth's attorney for 9 years, had drafted the will, had witnessed it alongside a notary named Jean Cagle, who worked out of a little office on 4th Street in Fort Smith. Darla was 71 years old, and she still wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she still said ma'am to everyone regardless of age, and she was the kind of lawyer who kept paper copies of everything because she had lived through enough hard drive failures to trust nothing electronic. I sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon and she laid it all out. The farmhouse, the 47 acres, the savings account at Arvest Bank, the life insurance policy that Nana Ruth had maintained since 1988. All of it was mine. There were no conditions, no splits, no provisions for Vernon or Denise or anyone else. Darla said Nana Ruth had been very specific about that. She said Nana Ruth had looked at her across this same desk and said, "I want it clear as creek water, Darla. That girl carried every bucket, and she gets every drop." I asked Darla how long I had before anything became public record. She explained the probate process in Crawford County. She told me the filing would happen within weeks, and once it was filed, anyone could look it up. I told her I understood. I asked her to proceed, but I also asked her to keep communications between us and only us. She looked at me over those reading glasses and she said, "Honey, I have been keeping secrets for people in this county since before you were born." I believed her. Then I started doing something I had learned to do in the Army. I prepared the ground. Not for an attack, for a defense. I drove to Fort Smith, and I met with a financial advisor named Paul Westbrook, whose office was in a converted Victorian on Garrison Avenue. Paul had no connection to my family, had never met Vernon, had never heard the name Dillard before I walked through his door. I chose him for exactly that reason. I sat with him for 2 hours, and I explained the assets, and I explained that there would be people who would contest things, and I explained that I needed everything structured so that, contested or not, the outcome would be the same. Paul did not ask me why my family was like this. He just took notes and built a plan. I had the farmhouse inspected. Roof, foundation, septic, well water. The inspector was a man named Terry from Alma, who had hands like catcher's mitts, and who crawled under the house on his belly and came out covered in red clay, and told me the bones were good, solid. The porch needed work, and the wiring in the kitchen was older than he liked, but nothing was dangerous. Nothing was failing. I filed that report away. I contacted the Crawford County Tax Office and confirmed every property tax payment for the last 12 years. I had receipts for all of them, every January. My name, my check. I put them in a folder. I contacted Arvest Bank and got statements showing every deposit I had ever made into Nana Ruth's account during the years her Social Security did not cover her medications. I put those in a folder too. I was not building a legal case exactly. I was building a wall made of paper and dates and amounts and my name over and over and over again. During this time, Vernon called me twice. The first time he wanted to know if I could help him move a couch. I said I was busy. He said, "Busy doing what?" I said, "Just busy, Vernon." He hung up. The second time he called to tell me that he had been talking to some people and he heard Nana Ruth might have had some money put away somewhere, and did I know anything about that? My chest tightened. I held the phone away from my face for 3 seconds, and then I brought it back and I said, "I think you should talk to her attorney if you have questions about her estate." He said, "What attorney?" I said, "Darla Simmons on Garrison Avenue." He said, "Since when does Nana Ruth have an attorney?" I said, "Since 9 years ago, Vernon." He was quiet for a long time and then he said, "Well, I guess I will call her then." I said, "Okay." I did not say anything else. He never called Darla. I know because she told me. She said nobody called. Nobody came by. Nobody asked. Denise did not contact me at all during this time. Not once. I learned later through a cousin on my mother's side that Denise had been telling people I was being secretive about something and that she had a bad feeling. She was not wrong about the secretive part. She was right to have a bad feeling. But she did not call me, and she did not come to my apartment, and she did not try to find out. She just talked. Denise always preferred the talking about a thing to the doing of a thing. 3 months passed. November, December, January. The probate moved through Crawford County at the speed that everything moves through Crawford County, which is to say slowly and without apology. I went to work at the VA. I treated patients. I drove to the farmhouse on weekends and I cleared brush, and I fixed the porch swing chain, and I stood in Nana Ruth's kitchen where the linoleum was cracked in the same places it had been cracked when I was 9 years old. I did not redecorate. I did not paint. Not yet. I just maintained, the way I always had. And I waited for the moment I knew was coming because it always comes. The moment when Vernon and Denise would find out, and the moment when they would decide that what was mine was supposed to be theirs. That moment arrived on a Saturday in February, at the worst possible place, at the worst possible time. And I will tell you about that next. That Saturday in February was the annual Hendricks family reunion barbecue. And I know what you're thinking, a barbecue in February in Pennsylvania? But that's how the Hendricks family has done it for 40 years. Uncle Bill built a permanent pit behind his property on Route 322 back in 1984, and it didn't matter if there was snow on the ground, the coals were going by noon, and the pulled pork was ready by 4. It was one of those traditions nobody questioned, because questioning it meant volunteering to organize something better, and nobody wanted that responsibility. I almost didn't go. I sat in Nana Ruth's kitchen that morning with my coffee getting cold, and I thought about calling Uncle Bill and saying I had a shift at the VA. But that was a lie, and I don't lie well. And more importantly, Nana Ruth would have gone. Nana Ruth never missed a Hendricks barbecue in 53 years, and I wasn't going to break that streak just because Vernon made my skin crawl. So I went. I wore my old Carhartt jacket and jeans and boots that had actual mud on them from actual work, and I brought a casserole dish of Nana Ruth's cornbread recipe because someone had to, and it might as well be me. I parked on the grass behind Uncle Bill's pole barn, next to maybe 15 other trucks and sedans, and I could already smell hickory smoke and hear Leonard Skinner playing from somebody's tailgate speaker, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt like I was 12 again, and none of the bad things had happened yet. Vernon and Denise were already there. Of course they were. Vernon was standing by the fire pit with a Yingling in his hand, holding court the way he always did, telling some story about a real estate deal in Meadville that was going to make him a fortune. Denise was at the folding table, arranging her store-bought potato salad into a ceramic bowl so it would look homemade, and I saw her do it, and she saw me see her do it, and neither of us said a word about it. The first hour was fine. I stayed on the periphery. I talked to Aunt Carol about her hip replacement. I talked to my second cousin Darren about his daughter's softball season. I ate cornbread and pulled pork, and I kept my distance, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be one of the easy ones. It was not one of the easy ones. Vernon found me around 3 o'clock. He walked over with that particular stride he has, the one that says, "I'm about to do you a favor you don't deserve." And he stood too close, and he said, "So I heard something interesting from Judge Patterson's office last week." He said it like it was casual, like he was mentioning the weather, but his eyes were sharp, and I knew. I knew he'd found out about the farmhouse, about the trust, about all of it. I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Yeah." He said, "It seems like Nana Ruth made some decisions before she passed that maybe she wasn't in the best state of mind to be making." He said, "And I think you and I need to have a conversation about what's fair, because that property has been in the whole family's possession for generations, and for one person to just take it, well, He let that hang. I said, Nana Ruth knew exactly what she was doing, Vernon. He said, see, that's the thing, Meredith. He always used my full name when he wanted to make me small. He said you were always up there with her, always whispering, always playing the good granddaughter. And maybe you convinced an old woman who was losing her mind to sign things she didn't understand. My hands were shaking, but not from anger. From the effort of keeping my voice level. I said she wasn't losing her mind. I said she was sharper than anyone in this family until the day she died, and you would know that if you had visited her more than twice a year. That's when his voice got loud enough for other people to hear. He wanted an audience. He always wanted an audience. He said, let's be honest here, Mir. He said, you're a nurse. You make what, $50,000 a year? You can't maintain that property. You can't pay the taxes. You're going to let it rot, and then sell it to some outsider and the whole family loses. He said, I'm trying to protect this family's legacy, and you're being selfish. Denise appeared beside him like she'd been waiting for her cue. She said, Vernon's right. It's not personal, Meredith, it's practical. She said, we've already talked to a lawyer. I could feel people looking at me. Aunt Carol had stopped mid-sentence. Darren had put down his plate. Even Uncle Bill had turned from the pit and was watching with tongs in one hand, frozen. And Vernon said the thing that broke something open. He looked around at everyone watching and he said with a little laugh, come on, let's be real. What does she even know about anything? She hands out pills at the VA. She's not exactly someone who makes important decisions for a living. That is when a voice came from behind me. It was calm and low, and it carried the way only a voice trained to carry across hostile terrain can carry. It said, actually, she made important decisions for a living when she was saving lives in Kandahar under fire. She made important decisions when she was triaging casualties at a forward operating base while people like you were flipping houses in Crawford County. And her call sign was steady. You want to know why they called her that? Because she never lost her composure. Not once. Not even when it would have been justified. I turned around and there was Frank Dominguez, 61 years old, silver beard, Wrangler jeans, a faded 3rd Special Forces Group ball cap. Frank had been a master sergeant. He'd done 4 deployments. He was also a patient of mine at the VA in Erie, where I'd been treating him for chronic pain and traumatic brain injury for 2 years. He lived 20 minutes from Uncle Bill's place, and he'd come to the barbecue because his wife Linda was Aunt Carol's neighbor, and the Hendricks barbecue had a way of pulling in people from the surrounding zip codes like a gravitational field. Frank walked forward and stood beside me, and he wasn't threatening, he wasn't puffing up, he was just present. He looked at Vernon, and he said, I don't know what your family business is, and I don't much care. But I know who this woman is. I've seen her personnel file because she showed it to me when I didn't believe a civilian nurse could understand what I'd been through. She was not a civilian nurse when it mattered. She was Captain Meredith Hendricks, Army Nurse Corps, attached to a forward surgical team, and she has a bronze star that she keeps in a drawer because she doesn't think she deserves it, even though she does. Vernon's face went white. Not red, white. The Yingling bottle in his hand dipped about 2 inches, like the weight of it had suddenly doubled. Denise's mouth opened and then closed without sound. Frank said you might want to rethink how you talk to her. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I know because I counted. It is a habit I developed in triage when you count seconds between breaths to see if a patient is declining or stabilizing. Vernon was declining. Vernon set his bottle down on the edge of the picnic table, but he misjudged the distance and it tipped over. Beer ran across the wood and dripped onto the grass, and nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody moved at all. Frank was still standing there with his hands at his sides, and his posture was completely relaxed, because men like Frank do not need to tense up to make a point. The point was already made. Denise was the first one to speak. She said, "Well, I did not know that," as if the information about my service record was something that had been deliberately hidden from her, like a secret, rather than something she had never bothered to ask about in 23 years. Vernon tried to recover. He does this thing when he is cornered, where he laughs and shakes his head, like the whole situation is absurd and beneath him. He did it then. He said, "Come on, man, it was just a joke." And Frank said, "I did not hear anyone laughing." That was the moment Uncle Ray finally stood up from his lawn chair. He had been sitting there through everything. Through Vernon calling me a bedpan jockey. Through the laughter. Through all of it. He stood up and he looked at Vernon and he said, "That is enough, boy. Sit down." And Vernon sat down. Not because Frank told him to, because his father told him to. And even at 41 years old, Vernon Beckley still responds to that voice like he is 12. I want to be clear about what happened next because it matters. Frank did not grandstand. He did not give a speech. He walked over to me and he said quietly, so only I could hear it, "Sorry it took me so long to say something, Captain." And then he went back to the grill and flipped the burgers like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. After that, the barbecue continued in a strange, muted way, like a party where someone has just received bad news. People ate, people drank, but the energy was different. Vernon stayed on the far side of the yard near the fence, and I noticed he was on his phone a lot, which is what he does when he does not want to make eye contact with anyone. Denise tried twice to come talk to me. The first time she said something about how she always thought nurses were important, which is the kind of compliment that makes you feel worse, not better. The second time she started to say that Vernon did not mean anything by it, and I held up my hand and said, "Denise, I am going to stop you right there, because I have spent 23 years listening to explanations for your son's behavior, and I am finished accepting them." She looked at me like I had slapped her. Maybe in a way I had. But I was not cruel about it. I just said it plainly, and then I walked away to get another plate of coleslaw because I was hungry, and because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is eat coleslaw while someone stares at the back of your head trying to figure out what just happened. 3 days after the barbecue, I got a call from Uncle Ray. He said, "Meredith, I want to talk to you about the house. The house on Elm Street. The one Aunt Lorraine had left in her will that was supposedly going to Vernon." Uncle Ray said he had been thinking, and he wanted me to know that Lorraine had actually written 2 versions of that section of the will. One left the house to Vernon outright. The other left it to me, with Vernon having the right to rent the lower unit at fair market rate. Lorraine had gone back and forth, and ultimately the attorney filed the version that gave it to Vernon, because Vernon had been present at the signing, and Lorraine did not want a scene. Uncle Ray said he had not felt right about it at the time, and he did not feel right about it now. He said he had spoken to the attorney, and while the will was the will and could not be changed, there were other assets in the estate that had not yet been distributed. Specifically, a savings account and a small investment portfolio that Lorraine had maintained separately. Uncle Ray said he wanted those to go to me. He said the amount was not enormous, but it was not nothing either. It was $61,000. I sat down on my kitchen floor when he told me. Not because of the money, although the money mattered, because Uncle Ray had seen. He had been sitting in that lawn chair, and he had seen everything, and even though he had not spoken up in the moment, he was speaking up now in the way that he could. It was late. It was years late. But it was real. He said one more thing before he hung up. He said, "Your aunt always said you were the one who reminded her of herself." I did not know what to say to that. So I said, "Thank you, Uncle Ray." And he said, Do not thank me. I should have done it sooner. Vernon found out about the money about a week later. He called me at 11 at night, which tells you something about his emotional regulation. He said, "This is unbelievable." He said, "You turned my own father against me." I said, "Vernon, your father made his own decision, and I had nothing to do with it." He said, "You have always been jealous of me and my family, and this is your way of getting back at us." I said, "Vernon, I am going to hang up now, and I hope you have a good night." And I hung up. He called back 4 times. I did not answer. The 5th time he left a voicemail that was 3 minutes long and mostly incoherent. He used the word ungrateful twice. He said I had embarrassed him in front of a stranger at his own barbecue, which was interesting because Frank was not a stranger. He was a guest, and it was not Vernon's barbecue, it was at Uncle Ray's house. Details matter. Vernon has never been good with details. Denise sent me a message the next morning. It was long, and it started with the words, "I think we need to talk." I did not respond to it. Not because I was being petty, but because I have learned that when someone says, "we need to talk," what they usually mean is, "I need to talk, and you need to listen and agree with me." I was done with that arrangement. The family split after that. Not dramatically, not with shouting matches or blocked phone numbers. It was quieter than that. It was Thanksgiving invitations that got sent to some people and not others. It was cousins who used to call every month calling every 3 months, and then every 6. It was the slow rearrangement of loyalty that happens when someone finally says out loud what everyone has been thinking quietly. My grandmother had a saying. She used to tell me it when I was small enough to sit on her lap in that old kitchen in Fayetteville. The one with the yellow curtains that always smelled like coffee and bacon grease, no matter what time of day it was. She would hold my face in both her hands, those rough hands that had scrubbed floors and packed parachute rigging and raised 4 children mostly alone, and she would say, "Elena, you do not owe anyone your smallness." I did not understand what she meant when I was 7. I thought she was telling me to eat more vegetables and grow tall. When I was 17, I thought it meant I should be louder, more aggressive, more willing to fight. When I was 23 and standing in a sandstorm outside Bagram, with a radio on my back and 3 officers depending on me to keep a relay alive through weather that was shredding antennas like paper, I thought it meant I should never quit. But sitting on my porch in Fayetteville that December, with the air cold enough that my breath made little clouds, and the sound of Fort Bragg artillery drills rumbling in the distance, like a storm that never arrives, I finally understood what she actually meant. She was not telling me to be big. She was not telling me to be loud. She was not telling me to fight. She was telling me that I had spent my entire life folding myself into shapes that made other people comfortable, making myself smaller at family tables so that Denise could feel like the impressive one, staying quiet about my service so that Uncle Ray could keep believing the story he told himself about who mattered and who did not, smiling through every dismissal and every joke and every casual cruelty. Because I thought that was what strong people did. That endurance was the same thing as strength. It is not. Endurance without boundaries is just suffering with good posture. I should have said something years ago. Not at a barbecue with 60 people watching. Not with Colonel Harrison there to validate me. I should have said something in a kitchen, or on a phone call, or at a quiet dinner. The first time Denise told someone I answered phones in the Army. I should have looked her in the eye and said, "That is not true, and here is what I actually did." Not to impress anyone, not to win some competition she invented, just to refuse the lie. But I did not, and I have to sit with that. I have to sit with the fact that my silence was not always discipline. Sometimes it was fear. Fear of being called difficult. Fear of being the one who ruined Thanksgiving by insisting on the truth. Fear of being seen as the cousin who could not take a joke. There is a version of humility that is actually just cowardice wearing a nicer outfit, and I wore it for years. That does not excuse what Denise did. It does not make Uncle Ray's contempt acceptable. It does not erase the look on Denise's face when she called me a paper pusher in front of people I had known my entire life. The way she smiled when she said it, like she was doing everyone a favor by putting me in my place. Those things were wrong. They were wrong every single time they happened. But I could have stopped them sooner. I could have drawn a line the first time instead of the 100th time. And the reason I did not was not because I was being the bigger person. It was because part of me, a small and stubborn part that I do not like very much, believed them. Believed that what I did was not impressive enough. Believed that because I did not come home with a dramatic story or a visible wound, maybe my service really was less than. Maybe I really was just a girl who answered phones. It took Colonel Harrison saying Overwatch in front of 60 people for me to feel like my service counted. And that bothers me. It should not have taken a retired colonel to make me believe something I already knew was true. I knew what I did in Quarangall. I knew what those relays meant. I knew that every pilot who landed safe, and every squad that got extracted, and every medevac that arrived on time, arrived because I kept those lines open through conditions that would have made most people quit. I knew all of that. But knowing something in your head and believing it in your chest are two very different things. And Denise had spent years slowly, carefully, patiently chipping away at the second one. That is what the quiet cruelties do. They do not break you all at once. They do not leave marks that other people can see. They just whisper the same lie over and over until you start whispering it to yourself. And then you do not need the bully anymore. You have become your own. My grandmother died in that kitchen in 2016. She was 81. She had a stroke while making cornbread on a Tuesday afternoon, and by the time the ambulance came, she was already gone. I was in South Korea on a signal deployment, and I did not make it home for the funeral. Denise did make it home. Denise gave a beautiful eulogy that everyone talked about for months. Denise posted pictures on social media with captions about what an incredible woman our grandmother was and how she shaped all of us. And none of that was wrong. Denise loved our grandmother too. That is the thing about complicated people. They are not wrong about everything. They are not cruel in every direction. Denise could love our grandmother genuinely and deeply and still spend years diminishing the granddaughter who inherited that woman's stubbornness. People are not simple. That is what makes forgiveness so hard. If Denise were a villain, it would be easy. I could hate her and move on and feel righteous about it. But she is not a villain. She is my cousin. She is the girl who taught me to French braid my hair in the summer of 1998. She is the woman who drove 3 hours to bring me soup when I had pneumonia in 2012. She is also the person who spent a decade making me feel like nothing I accomplished outside her shadow was worth mentioning. Both of those things are true. Both of them. I do not know what to do with that yet. Maybe I never will. Maybe the honest answer is that some relationships do not resolve. They just reach a distance where the damage cannot travel anymore, and you learn to live at that distance and call it peace. I sat on my back porch that evening, long after everyone else had gone home. The grill was cold. The folding tables were still out with their red checkered cloths lifting slightly at the corners whenever the breeze came through. I had not cleaned up yet, and I did not want to. There was something about the mess that felt honest. Paper plates with smudges of barbecue sauce, plastic cups half full of sweet tea going warm, a tray of deviled eggs that nobody had finished. Evidence that people had been here, that something had happened. The cicadas were loud, the way they always are in North Carolina in July. That rising and falling hum that sounds like the earth itself is breathing. I used to hate that sound when I was a kid, thought it was creepy. Now it is maybe my favorite thing about summer. It means the day is done. It means you survived another one. My phone was on the armrest of the lawn chair next to me. I had turned it face down 2 hours ago, and I had not touched it since. Denise had called twice. I did not listen to the voicemails. I would eventually, just not tonight. Tonight was mine. I kept thinking about something Grandpa Earl told me the last time I saw him before the stroke took his speech. We were sitting on a porch not so different from this one. His porch in Sanford, with the wooden slats that creaked and the ceiling fan that wobbled and the view of absolutely nothing remarkable. Just a yard, just a road, just a sky doing what skies do at the end of a day. He was drinking decaf because Grandma had banned the real stuff, and he looked at me and said, "You already know who you are, Elena. You just keep letting loud people talk you out of it." I remember thinking at the time that he was being kind, that it was a nice thing a grandfather says to a granddaughter who seems a little lost. I did not understand that he was being precise. That he had watched me for years fold myself into smaller and smaller shapes to fit into rooms that were never built for someone my size. Not physically. I am 5'4" and 130 pounds soaking wet. But the other kind of size. The kind you earn in places where earning it means someone else might not come home. He saw it. He saw all of it. And he said it once because Earl Mackey did not believe in saying things twice. I understand that now. I understand it sitting here with barbecue smoke still faintly in my hair and the sky going that deep purple that happens right before the stars come out over the Piedmont. I understand that knowing who you are is not a loud thing. It is not a credential you frame or a story you tell at parties or a call sign that makes a retired Green Beret stand at attention at a backyard cookout. Those things happened, and they matter, but they are not the core of it. The core of it is quieter. The core of it is choosing every single day not to become the small version of yourself that other people's comfort requires. And also not becoming hard. Not becoming someone who uses what she has been through as a wall or a weapon. There is a space between those two things. It is narrow, and it is difficult to stand in, and most days I do not get it right. But I try. That is what I have. I try. Colonel Beckett sent me a text around 9. Just 3 words. Semper Fi, Elena. Wrong branch, technically. He was Army and I was Army, and Semper Fi belongs to the Marines. But operators borrow from each other. We always have. It is a language that does not care about branches. It cares about meaning. And the meaning was clear. I am still here. You are still here. That counts. I typed back, "Thank you, sir." Then I put the phone face down again. The stars came out one at a time, the way they do when you are patient enough to watch. First one over the tree line, then another, then so many you lose count and the sky stops being empty and starts being full, and you realize it was never empty at all. You just were not looking. I thought about the women I served with. Ramirez, who could run a faster mile than half the men in our unit and never once bragged about it. Okafor, who held a tourniquet on a kid's leg for 40 minutes in Kandahar, while rounds were hitting the wall 6 feet above her head. Thompson, who went home and became a middle school teacher, and told me once that the hardest thing she ever did was not combat. It was learning to be soft again, learning that softness was not the same thing as weakness. She was right. It is not. If you are listening to this, and you have someone in your life who makes you feel like your accomplishments do not count, who finds a way to make every room about them, who loves you in some real way, but also needs you to be less so they can feel like enough, I want you to hear me say something, and I want you to believe it, even if you cannot feel it yet. You do not need anyone to verify what you have lived through. You do not need a colonel to walk into a barbecue and say your name with reverence for other people to understand your worth. That moment was beautiful, and I will carry it with me for the rest of my life, but it did not make me worthy. I was worthy before he got there. I was worthy every single day that I sat quiet while someone else talked over me. My silence was not agreement. It was patience. And patience is not the absence of strength. It is strength choosing when to speak. So choose. When you are ready. In your own time. In your own voice. You do not have to be loud. You just have to be clear. I sat on that porch until the citronella candle burned down to nothing, and the last of the sweet tea went warm in my cup, and the cicadas finally quieted, and the only sound left was the night itself. Breathing in, breathing out. The way it does when the day is finished and the work is done, and you are still here to hear it. I went inside. I locked the door. I washed my face. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time, not searching for something, just seeing what was there. It was enough.